Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Unsettling Tales, where I will be continuing through the hefty tome, the Giant Book of Vampires, from 1992, I think it was. How are my sound levels? Let me know if everybody can hear me, or if I need to turn them up a bit. Content warnings for everything to do with vampires. Blood, death, probably mind control, all sort of horror-related things. Unless anybody has any further information, I shall go on with the next story in the anthology, which is called The Man Who Loved the Vampire Lady by Brian Stableford. Brian Stableford's The Empire of Fear was one of the most acclaimed fantasy novels of the past few years. This was the 90s. And the story which follows eventually became the first chapter of that epic alternate history of a world ruled by vampires. More recently, he's done the same thing for lycanthropes in the novel Werewolves of London, and some of his best short stories have been collected in Sexual Chemistry. As a writer, critic and academic, Stableford has also written a great deal of non-fiction and edited several anthologies. Thanks, Jim. Including Tales of the Wandering Jew and The Daedalus Book of English Fantasy, the 19th century. The Man Who Loved the Vampire Lady is a touchingly romantic evocation of the vampire that also sets the scene for Stableford's longer work. A man who loves a vampire lady may not die young, but cannot live forever. Wallachian proverb. It was the 13th of June in the year of our Lord 1623. Grande Normandy was in the grip of an early spell of warm weather, and the streets of London bathed in sunlight. There were crowds everywhere, and the port was busy with ships, 3 having docked that very day. One of the ships, the Free Martin, was from the Moorish enclave, and had produce from the heart of Africa, including ivory and the skins of exotic animals. There were rumours, too, of secret and more precious goods, jewels and magical charms, but such rumours always attended the docking of any vessel from remote parts of the world. Beggars and street urchins had flocked to the dockland, responsive as ever to such whisperings, and were plaguing every sailor in the streets, as anxious for gossip as for copper coins. It seemed that the only faces not animated by excitement were those worn by the severed heads that dressed the spikes atop the Southwark Gate. The Tower of London, though, stood quite aloof from the hubbub, its tall and forbidding turrets so remote from the streets that they belonged to a different world. Edmund Cordery, mechanician to the court of the Archduke Girard, tilted the small concave mirror on the brass device that rested on his workbench, catching the rays of the afternoon sun and deflecting the light through the system of lenses. He turned away and directed his son Noel to take his place. "Tell me if all is well," he said tiredly. "I can hardly focus my eyes, let alone the instrument." Noel closed his left eye and put his other to the microscope. He turned the wheel that adjusted the height of the stage. "It's perfect," he said. "What is it?" "The wing of a moth." Edmund scanned the polished tabletop, checking that the other slides were in readiness for the demonstration. The prospect of Lady Carmilla's visit filled him with a complex anxiety that he resented in himself. Even in the old days, she had not come to his laboratory often, but to see her here, on his own territory, as it were, would be bound to awaken memories that were untouched by the glimpses that he caught of her in the public parts of the tower, and on ceremonial occasions. "The water slide isn't ready," Noel pointed out. Edmund shook his head. Edmund bowed slightly, but met her gaze. She had not changed in the slightest degree, of course, since the days when he had been intimate with her. She was 600 years old, hardly younger than the Archduke, and the years were impotent as far as her appearance were concerned. Her complexion was much darker than his, her eyes a deep liquid brown, and her hair jet black. He had not stood so close to her for several years, and he could not help the tide of memories rising in his mind. For her, it would be different. His hair was grey now, his skin creased. He must seem an altogether different person. As he met her gaze, though, it seemed to him that she, too, was remembering, and not without fondness. "My lady," he said, his voice quite steady, "may I present my son and apprentice, Noel?" Noel bowed more deeply than his father, blushing with embarrassment. The Lady Carmilla favoured the youth with a smile. "He has the look of you, Master Cordery," she said, a casual compliment. She returned her attention then to the instrument. "The designer was correct?" she asked. "Yes, indeed," he replied. "The device is most ingenious. I would dearly like to meet the man who thought of it. A fine discovery, though it taxed the talent of the lens grinder severely. I think we might make a better one, with much care and skill. This is but a poor example, as one must expect from a first attempt." The Lady Carmilla seated herself at the bench, and Edmund showed her how to apply her eye to the instrument, and how to adjust the focusing wheel in the mirror. She expressed surprise at the appearance of the magnified moth's wing, and Edmund took her through this series of prepared slides, which included other parts of the insects' bodies, and sections through the stems and seeds of plants. "I need a sharper knife and a steadier hand, my lady," he told her. "The device exposes the clumsiness of my cutting." "Oh no, Master Cordery," she assured him politely. "These are quite pretty enough, but we were told that more interesting things might be seen. Living things too small for ordinary sight." Edmund bowed in apology, and explained about the preparation of water slides. He made a new one using a pipette to take a drop from a jar full of dirty river water. Patiently, he helped the lady search the slide for the tiny creatures that human eyes were not equipped to perceive. He showed her one that flowed as if it was semi-liquid itself, and tinier ones that moved by means of cilia. She was quite captivated, and watched for some time, moving the slide very gently with her painted fingernails. Eventually she asked, "Have you looked at other fluids?" "What kind of fluids?" he asked, though the question was quite clear to him and disturbed him. She was not prepared to mince words with him. "Blood, Master Cordery," she said very softly. Her past acquaintance with him had taught her respect for his intelligence, and he half regretted it. "Blood clots very quickly," he told her. "I could not produce a satisfactory slide. It would take unusual skill." "I'm sure that it would," she replied. "Noel has made drawings of many of the things we have looked at," said Edmund. "Would you like to see them?" She accepted the change of subject and indicated that she would. She moved to Noel's station and began sorting through the drawings, occasionally looking up at the boy to compliment him on his work. Edmund stood by, remembering how sensitive he had once been to her moods and desires, trying hard to work out now exactly what she was thinking. Something in one of her contemplative glances at Noel sent an icy pang of dread into Edmund's gut, and he found his more important fears momentarily displaced by what might have been anxiety for his son, or simply jealousy. He cursed himself again for his weakness. "May I take these to show the Archduke?" asked the Lady Carmilla, addressing the question to Noel rather than to his father. The boy nodded, still too embarrassed to construct a proper reply. She took a selection of the drawings and rolled them into a scroll. She stood and faced Edmund again. "We are most interested in this apparatus," she informed him. "We must consider carefully whether to provide you with new assistance, to encourage development of the appropriate skills. In the meantime, you may return to your ordinary work. I will send someone for the instrument so that the Archduke can inspect it at his leisure. Your son draws very well and must be encouraged. You and he may visit me in my chambers on Monday next. We will dine at 7 o'clock, and you may tell me about all your recent work." Edmund bowed to signal his acquiescence. It was, of course, a command, rather than an invitation. He moved before her to the door in order to hold it open for her. The two exchanged another brief glance as she went past him. When she had gone, it was as though something taut and wound inside him, leaving him relaxed and emptied. He felt strangely cool and distant as he considered the possibility, stronger now, that his life was in peril. When the twilight had faded, Edmund lit a single candle on the bench and sat staring into the flame, while he drank dark wine from a flask. He did not look up when Noel came into the room. When the boy brought another stool close to his and sat down upon it, he offered the flask. Noel took it, but sipped rather gingerly. "I'm old enough to drink now," he commented dryly. "You're old enough," Edmund assured him, "but beware of excess, and never drink alone. Conventional fatherly advice, I believe." Noel reached across the bench so that he could stroke the barrel of the microscope with slender fingers. "What are you afraid of?" he asked. Edmund sighed. "You're old enough for that too, I suppose." "I think you ought to tell me." Edmund looked at the brass instrument and said, "It were better to keep things like this dark secret. Some human mechanician, I dare say, eager to please the vampire lords and ladies, showed off his cleverness, as proud as a peacock. Thoughtless, inevitable though, now that all this play with lenses has become fashionable. You'll be glad of eyeglasses when your sight begins to fail," Noel told him. "In any case, I can't see the danger in this new toy." Edmund smiled. New toys, he mused. Clocks to tell the time, mills to grind the corn, lenses to aid human sight, produced by human craftsmen for the delight of their masters. I think we've finally succeeded in proving to the vampires just how clever we are, and how much more there is to know than we already know." "You think the vampires are beginning to fear us?" Edmund gulped wine from the flask and passed it again to his son. "Their rule is founded in fear and superstition," he said, quietly. "They're long-lived, suffer only mild attacks of diseases that are fatal to us, and have marvellous powers of regeneration. But they're not immortal. They're vastly outnumbered by humans. Terror keeps them safe, but terror is based in ignorance, and behind their haughtiness and arrogance there's an annoying fear of what might happen if humans ever lost their supernatural reverence for vampire kind. It's very difficult for them to die, but they don't fear death any the less for that. There have been rebellions against vampire rule, but they've always failed." Edmund nodded to concede the point. "There are 3 million people in Grand Normandy," he said, "and less than 5,000 vampires. There were only 40,000 vampires in the entire Imperium of Gaul, and about the same number in the Imperium of Byzantium. No telling how many there may be in the Khanate of Wallachia and Cathay, but not so very many more. In Africa, the vampires must be outnumbered 3,000 to 4,000 to 1. If people no longer saw them as demons and demigods, as unconquerable forces of evil, their empire would be fragile. The centuries through which they live give them wisdom, but longevity seems to be inimical to a creative thought. Excuse me. They learn, but they don't invent. Humans remain the true masters of art and science, which are forces of change. They've tried to control that, to turn it to their advantage, but it remains a thorn in their side. But they do have power, insisted Noel. They are vampires. Edmund shrugged. Their longevity is real, their powers of regeneration too. But is it really their magic that makes them so? I don't know for sure what merit there is in their incantations and rituals, but I don't think even they know. They cling to their rights because they dare not abandon them. But where the power that makes humans into vampires really comes from, no one knows. From the devil? I think not. I don't believe in the devil. I think it's something in the blood. I think vampirism may be a kind of disease, but a disease that makes men stronger instead of weaker, insulates them against death instead of killing them. If that is the case, do you see now why the Lady Carmilla asked whether I had looked at blood beneath the microscope? Noel stared at the instrument for 20 seconds or so, mulling over the idea. Then he laughed. If we could all become vampires, he said lightly, we'd have to suck one another's blood. Edmund couldn't bring himself to look for such ironies. For him, the possibilities inherent in discovering the secrets of vampire nature were much more immediate and utterly bleak. It's not true that they need to suck the blood of humans, he told the boy. It's not nourishment. It gives them a kind of pleasure that we can't understand, and it's part of the mystique that makes them so terrible, and hence so powerful. He stopped, feeling embarrassed. He did not know how much Noel knew about his sources of information. He and his wife never talked about the days of his affair with the Lady Carmilla, but there was no way to keep gossip and rumour from reaching the boy's ears. Noel took the flask again, and this time took a deeper draught from it. I've heard, he said distantly, that humans find pleasure too, in their blood being drunk. No, replied Edmund calmly, that's untrue, unless one counts the small pleasure of sacrifice. The pleasure that a human man takes from a vampire lady is the same pleasure that he takes from a human lover. It might be different for the girls who entertain vampire men, but I suspect it's just the excitement of hoping that they may become vampires themselves. Noel hesitated, and would probably have dropped the subject, but Esmond realised suddenly that he did not want the subject dropped. The boy had a right to know, and perhaps might one day need to know. It's not entirely true, Edmund corrected himself. When the Lady Carmilla used to taste my blood, it did give me pleasure. In a way. It pleased me because it pleased her. There is an excitement in loving a vampire lady, which makes it different from loving an ordinary woman. Even though the chance that a vampire lady's lover may himself become a vampire is so remote as to be inconsiderable. Noel blushed, not knowing how to react to this acceptance into his father's confidence. Awkward. Finally, he decided it was best to pretend a purely academic interest. Why are there so many more vampire women than men? He asked. No one knows for sure, Edmund said. No humans, at any rate. I can tell you what I believe from hearsay and from reasoning, but you must understand that it is a dangerous thing to think about, let alone to speak about. Noel nodded. The vampires keep their history secret, said Edmund, and they try to control the writing of human history, but the following facts are probably true. Vampirism came to Western Europe in the 5th century with the vampire-led hordes of Attila. Attila must have known well enough how to make more vampires. He converted both Aetius, who became ruler of the Imperium of Gaul, and Theodosius II, the Emperor of the East, who was later murdered. Of all the vampires that now exist, the vast majority must be converts. I have heard reports of vampire children born to vampire ladies, but it must be an extremely rare occurrence. Vampire men seem to be much less virile than human men. It is said that they couple very rarely. Nevertheless, they frequently take human consorts, and these consorts often become vampires. Vampires usually claim that this is a gift bestowed deliberately by magic, but I am not sure that they can control the process. I think the semen of vampire men carries some kind of seed that communicates vampirism, much as the semen of humans makes women pregnant, and just as haphazardly. Content warning: vampirism as an STD. Oh, it's themes around that sort of thing. That's why the male lovers of vampire ladies don't become vampires. Noel considered this, and then asked, then where do vampire lords come from? They're converted by other male vampires, Edmund said, just as Attila converted Aetius and Theodosius. He did not elaborate, but waited to see whether Noel understood the implication. An expression of disgust, content warning, homophobia, disgusted the boy's face, and Edmund did not know whether to be glad or sorry that his son could follow the argument through. Because it doesn't always happen, Edmund went on. It's easy for the vampires to pretend they have some special magic, but some women never become pregnant, though they lie with their husbands for years. It is said, though, that a human may also become a vampire by drinking a vampire's blood, if he knows the appropriate magic spell. It is a sex thing. Or it's a blood-borne illness. That's a rumour the vampires don't like, and they exact terrible penalties if anyone is caught trying to the experiment. The ladies of our own court, of course, are for the most part one-time lovers of the Archduke or his cousins. It would be indelicate to speculate about the conversion of the Archduke, though he's certainly acquainted with Aetius. Noel reached out a hand palm downwards and made a few passes above the candle flame, making it flicker from side to side. He stared at the microscope. Have you looked at blood? He asked. I have, replied Edmund. And semen. Human blood, of course, and human semen. And? Edmund shook his head. They're certainly not homogeneous fluids, he said. But the instrument isn't good enough for really detailed inspection. There are small corpuscles. The ones in semen have long, writhing tails. But there's more, much more to be seen if I had the chance. By tomorrow this instrument will be gone. I don't think I'll be given the chance to build another. You're surely not in danger. You're an important man. Your loyalty has never been in question. People think of you as being almost a vampire yourself, a black magician. The kitchen girls are afraid of me because I'm your son. They cross themselves when they see me. Edmund laughed a little bitterly. I have no doubt they suspect me of intercourse with demons. Good choice of words there, Edmund. And avoid my gaze for fear of the spell of the evil eye. But none of that matters to the vampires. To them, I'm only a human, and for all that they value my skills, they'd kill me without a thought if they suspected that I might have dangerous knowledge. Noel was clearly alarmed by this. Wouldn't... He stopped, but saw Edmund waiting for him to ask, and carried on after only a brief pause. The Lady Carmilla? Wouldn't she... protect me? Edmund shook his head. Not even if I were her favourite still. Vampire loyalty is to vampires. She was human once. It counts for nothing. She's been a vampire for nearly 600 years, but it wouldn't be any different if she were no older than I. But she did love you. In her way, said Edmund sadly. In her way. He stood up then, no longer feeling the urgent desire to help his son to understand. There were things the boy could find out only for himself, and might never have to. He took up the candle tray and shielded the flame with his hand as he walked to the door. Noel followed him, leaving the empty flask behind. Edmund left the citadel by the so-called Traitor's Gate and crossed the Thames by the Tower Bridge. The houses on the bridge were in darkness now, but there was still a trickle of traffic, even at 2 a.m. The business of the great city did not come to a standstill. The night had clouded over, and a light drizzle had begun to fall. Some of the oil lamps that were supposed to keep the thoroughfare lit at all times had gone out, and there was not a lamplighter in sight. Edmund did not mind the shadows, though. He was aware, before he reached the south bank, that 2 men were dogging his footsteps, and he dawdled in order to give them the impression that he would be easy to track. Once he entered the network of streets surrounding the leather market there, he gave them the slip. He knew the maze of filthy streets well enough. He had lived here as a child. It was while he was apprenticed to a local clockmaker that he had learned the cleverness with tools that had eventually brought him to the notice of his predecessor, and had sent him on the road to fortune and celebrity. He had a brother and a sister still living and working in the district, though he saw them very rarely. Neither one of them was proud to have a reputed magician for a brother, and they had not forgiven him his association with the Lady Carmilla. He picked his way carefully through the garbage in the dark alleys, unperturbed by the sound of scavenging rats. He kept his hands on the pommel of the dagger that was clasped to his belt, but he had no need to draw it. Because the stars were hidden, the night was pitch dark, and few of the windows were lit from within by candlelight, but he was able to keep track of his progress by reaching out to touch familiar walls every now and again. He came eventually to a tiny door set 3 steps down from a side street, and rapped upon it quickly, 3 times and then twice. There was a long pause before he felt the door yield beneath his fingers, and he stepped inside hurriedly. Until he relaxed when the door clicked shut again, he did not realize how tense he had been. He waited for a candle to be lit. The light, when it came, illuminated a thin face, crabbed and wrinkled, the eyes very pale and the wispy white hair gathered imperfectly behind a linen bonnet. "The Lord be with you," he whispered. "And with you, Edmund Cordery," she croaked. He frowned at the use of his name. It was a deliberate breach of etiquette, a feeble and meaningless gesture of independence. She did not like him, though he had never been less than kind to her. She did not fear him, as so many others did, but she considered him tainted. They had been bound together in the business of the fraternity for nearly 20 years, but she would never completely trust him. She led him into an inner room and left him there to take care of this business. A stranger stepped from the shadows. He was short, stout, and bald, perhaps 60 years old. He made the special sign of the cross, and Edmund responded. "I'm Cordery," he said. "Were you followed?" The older man's tone was deferential and fearful. "Not here. They followed me from the tower, but it was easy to shake them loose." "That's bad." "Perhaps, but it has to do with another matter, not with our business. There's no danger for you. Do you have what I asked for?" The stout man nodded uncertainly. "My masters are unhappy," he said. "I have been asked to tell you that they do not want you to take risks. You are too valuable to place yourself in peril." "I am in peril already. Events are overtaking us. In any case, it is neither your concern nor that of your masters. It is for me to decide." The stout man shook his head, but it was a gesture of resignation rather than a denial. He pulled something from beneath the chair where he had waited in the shadows. It was a large box clad in leather. A row of small holes was set in the longer side, and there was a sound of scratching from within that testified to the presence of living creatures. "You did exactly as I instructed?" asked Edmund. The small man nodded, then put his hand on the mechanician's arm fearfully. "Don't open it, sir, I beg you. Not here." "There's nothing to fear," Edmund assured him. "You haven't been in Africa, sir, as I have. Believe me, everyone is afraid, and not merely humans. They say that vampires are dying too." "Yes, I know," said Edmund distractedly. He shook off the older man's restraining hand and undid the straps that sealed the box. He lifted the lid, but not far, just enough to let the light in, and to let him see what was inside. The box contained 2 big grey rats. They cowered from the light. Edmund shut the lid again and fastened the straps. "It's not my place, sir," said the little man hesitantly, "but I'm not sure that you really understand what you have there. I've seen the cities of West Africa. I've been in Corunna too, and Marseille. They remember other plagues in those cities, and all the horror stories are emerging again to haunt them. Sir, if any such thing ever came to London—" Edmund tested the weight of the box to see whether he could carry it comfortably. "It's not your concern," he said. "Forget everything that's happened. I will communicate with your masters. It is in my hands now." "Forgive me," said the other, "but I must say this. There is naught to be gained from destroying vampires if we destroy ourselves too. It would be a pity to wipe out half of Europe in the cause of attacking our oppressors." Edmund stared at the stout man coldly. "You talk too much," he said. "Indeed, you talk a deal too much." "I beg your pardon, sire." Edmund hesitated for a moment, wondering whether to reassure the messenger that his anxiety was understandable, but he had learned long ago that where the business of the fraternity was concerned, it was best to say as little as possible. There was no way of knowing when this man would speak again of this affair, or to whom, or with what consequence. The mechanician took up the box, making sure that he could carry it comfortably. The rats stirred inside, scrabbling with their small clawed feet. With his free hand, Edmund made the sign of the cross again. "God go with you," said the messenger, with urgent sincerity. "And with thy spirit," replied Edmund colourlessly. Then he left, without pausing to exchange a ritual farewell with the crone. He had no difficulty in smuggling his burden back to the tower, by means of a gate where the guard was long practised in the art of turning a blind eye. When Monday came, Edmund and Noel made their way to the Lady Carmilla's chambers. Noel had never been in such an apartment before, and it was a source of wonder to him. Edmund watched the boy's reactions to the carpets, the wall hangings, the mirrors and ornaments, and could not help but recall the first time he had entered these chambers. Nothing had changed here, and the rooms were full of provocations to stir and sharpen his faded memories. Younger vampires tended to change their surroundings often, addicted to novelty, as if they feared the prospect of being changeless themselves. The Lady Carmilla had long since passed beyond this phase of her career. She had grown used to changelessness, had transcended the kind of attitude to the world that permitted boredom and ennui. She had adapted herself to the new aesthetic of existence, whereby her personal space became an extension of her own eternal sameness, and innovation was confined to tightly controlled areas of her life, including the irregular shifting of her erotic affections from one lover to another. Erotic affections. The sumptuousness of the ladies' table was a further source of astonishment to Noel. Silver plates and forks he had imagined, and crystal goblets, and carved decanters of wine, but the lavishness of provision for just 3 diners, the casual waste, was something that obviously set him aback. He had always known that he was himself a member of a privileged elite, and that by the standards of the greater world, Master Cordery and his family ate well. The revelation that there was a further order of magnitude to distinguish the private world of the real aristocracy clearly made its impact upon him. Edmund had been very careful in preparing his dress, fetching from his closet finery that he had not put on for many years. On official occasions, he was always concerned to play the part of a mechanician, and dressed in order to sustain that appearance. He never appeared as a courtier, always as a functionary. Now, though, he was reverting to a kind of performance that Noel had never seen him play, and though the boy had no idea of the subtleties of his father's performance, he clearly understood something of what was going on. He had complained acidly about the dull and plain way in which his father had made him dress. Edmund ate and drank sparingly, and was pleased to note that Noel did likewise, obeying his father's instructions despite the obvious temptations of the lavish provision. But she came quickly enough, by her standards, to the real business of the evening. "My cousin Gerard," she told Edmund, "is quite enraptured by your clever device. He finds it most interesting." "Then I am pleased to make a gift of it," Edmund replied, "and I will be pleased to make another as a gift for your ladyship." "That is not our desire," she said coolly. "In fact, we have other matters in mind. The Archduke and his seneschal have discussed certain tasks that you might profitably carry out. Instructions will be communicated to you in due time, I have no doubt." "Thank you, my lady," said Edmund. "The ladies of the court were pleased with the drawings that I showed them," said Lady Carmilla, turning to look at Noel. "They marvelled at the thought that a cupful of Thames water might contain thousands of tiny living creatures. Do you think that our bodies, too, might be the habitation of countless invisible insects?" Noel opened his mouth to reply, because the question was addressed to him, but Edmund interrupted smoothly. "There are creatures that may live upon our bodies," he said, "and worms that may live within. We are told that the macrocosm reproduces in essence the microcosm of human beings. Perhaps there is a small microcosm within us, where our natures are reproduced again, incalculably small. I have read, Master Cordery," that she cut in, "that the illnesses that afflict humankind might be carried from person to person by means of these tiny creatures." "The idea that diseases were communicated from one person to another by tiny seeds was produced in antiquity," Edmund replied, "but I do not know how such seeds might be recognized, and I think it very unlikely that the creatures we have seen in river water could possibly be of that character." "It is a disquieting thought," she insisted, "that our bodies might be inhabited by creatures of which we can know nothing, and that every breath we take might be carrying into us seeds of all kinds of change, too small to be seen or tasted. It makes me feel uneasy." "But there is no need," Edmund protested. "Seeds of corruptibility take root in human flesh, but yours is inviolate." "You know that is not so, Master Cordery," she said levelly. "You have seen me ill yourself. That was a pox that killed many humans, my lady, yet it gave you no more than a mild fever. We have reports from the Imperium of Byzantium, and from the Moorish enclave too, that there is plague in Africa, and that it has now reached the southern regions of the Imperium of Gaul. It is said that this plague makes little distinction between human and vampire." "Rumours, my lady," said Edmund soothingly. "You know how news becomes blacker as it travels." Lady Carmilla turned again to Noel, and this time addressed him by name, so there could be no opportunity for Edmund to usurp the privilege of answering her. "Are you afraid of me, Noel?" she asked. The boy was startled, and stumbled slightly over his reply, which was in the negative. "You must not lie to me," she told him. "You are afraid of me, because I am a vampire. Master Cordery is a skeptic, and must have told you that vampires have less common magic than is commonly credited to us. But he must also have told you that I can do you harm if I will. Would you like to be a vampire yourself, Noel?" Noel was still confused by the correction, and hesitated over his reply, but eventually said, "Yes, I would." "Of course you would," she purred. "All humans would be vampires if they could, no matter how they might pretend when they bend the knee in church. And men can become vampires. Immortality is within our gift. Because of this, we have always enjoyed the loyalty and devotion of the greater number of our human subjects. We have always rewarded that devotion in some measure. Few have joined our ranks, but the many have enjoyed centuries of order and stability. The vampires rescued Europe from a dark age, and as long as vampires rule, barbarism will always be held in check. Our rule has not always been kind, because we cannot tolerate defiance, but the alternative would have been far worse. Even so, there are men who would destroy us. Did you know that?" Noel did not know how to reply to this, so he simply stared, waiting for her to continue. She seemed a little impatient with his gracelessness, and Edmund deliberately let the awkward pause go on. He saw a certain advantage in allowing Noel to make a poor impression. "There is an organisation of rebels," Lady Carmilla went on, "a secret society ambitious to discover the secret way by which vampires are made. They put about the idea that they would make all men immortal. This is a lie, and foolish. The members of this brotherhood seek power for themselves." The vampire lady paused to direct the clearing of one set of dishes and the bringing of another. She asked for a new wine, too. Her gaze wandered back and forth between the gauche youth and his self-assured father. "The loyalty of your family is, of course, beyond question," she eventually continued. "No one understands the workings of society like a mechanician, who knows well enough how forces must be balanced, and how the different parts of a machine must interlock and support one another." "It is so hard looking after you poor humans." "Master Cordery knows well how the cleverness of rulers resembles the cleverness of clockmakers, do you not?" "Indeed I do, my lady," replied Edmund. "There might be a way," she said in a strangely distant tone, "that a good mechanician might earn a conversion to vampirism." Edmund was wise enough not to interpret this as an offer, or a promise. He accepted a measure of the new wine and said, "My lady, there are matters that it would be as well for us to discuss in private. May I send my son to his room?" The Lady Carmilla's eyes narrowed just a little, but there was hardly any expression in her finely etched features. Edmund held his breath, knowing that he had forced a decision upon her that she had not intended to make so soon. "The poor boy has not quite finished his meal," she said. "I think he has had enough, my lady," Edmund countered. Noel did not disagree, and after a brief hesitation the lady bowed to signal her permission. Edmund asked Noel to leave, and when he was gone, the Lady Carmilla rose from her seat and went from the dining room into an inner chamber. Edmund followed her. "You were presumptuous, Master Cordery," she told him. "I was carried away, my lady. There are too many memories here." "The boy is mine," she said, "if I so choose. You do know that, do you not?" Edmund bowed. "I did not ask you here tonight to make you witness the seduction of your son." really. I could have. Did you now? Nor do you think that I did. This matter that you would discuss with me, does it contain science or treason? Science, my lady. As you have said yourself, my loyalty is not in question. Bold of you to assume. Carmilla laid herself upon a sofa, and indicated that Edmund should take a chair nearby. This was the antechamber to her bedroom, and the air was sweet with the odour of cosmetics. Speak, she bade him. I believe that the Archduke is afraid of what my little device might reveal, he said. He fears that it will expose to the eye such seeds as carry vampirism from one person to another, just as it might expose the seeds that carry disease. I think that the man who devised the instrument may have been put to death already, but I think you know well enough that a discovery once made is likely to be made again and again. You are uncertain as to what course of action would best serve your ends, because you cannot tell whence the greater threat to your rule might come. There is the fraternity, which is dedicated to your destruction. There is a plague in Africa, from which even vampires may die. And there is the new sight, which renders visible what previously lurked unseen. Do you want my advice, Lady Carmilla? Do you have any advice, Edmund? Yes. Do not try to control by terror and persecution the things that are happening. Let your rule be unkind now as it has been before, and it will open the way to destruction. Should you concede power gently, you might live centuries yet, but if you strike out, your enemies will strike back. The vampire lady leaned her head back, looking at the ceiling. She contrived a small laugh. I cannot take advice such as that to the Archduke, she told him flatly. I thought not, my lady, Edmund replied very calmly. You humans have your own immortality, she complained. Your faith promises it, and you all affirm it. Your faith tells you that you must not covet the immortality that is ours, and we do no more than agree with you when we guard it so jealously. You should look to Christ for fortune, not to us. I think you know well enough that we could not convert the world if we wanted to. Our magic is such that it can only be used sparingly. Are you distressed because it has never been offered to you? Are you bitter? Are you becoming our enemy because you cannot become our kin? You have nothing to fear from me, my lady, he lied. Then he added, not quite sure whether it was a lie or not, I loved you faithfully. I still do. She sat up straight then and reached out a hand as though to stroke his cheek, though he was too far away for her to reach. That is what I told the Archduke, she said, when he suggested to me that you might be a traitor. I promised him that I could test your loyalty more keenly in my chambers than his officers in theirs. I do not think you could delude me, Edmund. Do you? No, my lady, he replied. By morning, she told him gently, I will know whether or not you are a traitor. That you will, he assured her. That you will, my lady. Bow chicka wow wow. He woke before her, his mouth dry and his forehead burning. He was not sweating. Indeed, he was possessed by a feeling of desiccation, as though the moisture were being squeezed out of his organs. His head was aching, and the light of the morning sun that streamed through the unshuttered window hurt his eyes. He pulled himself up to a half-sitting position, pushing the coverlet back from his bare chest. So soon, he thought. Foreshadowing indeed, yes. He had not expected to be consumed so quickly, but he was surprised to find that his reaction was one of relief rather than fear or regret. He had difficulty collecting his thoughts, and was perversely glad to accept that he did not need to. He looked down at the cuts that she had made on his breast with her little silver knife. They were raw and red, and made a strange contrast with the faded scars, whose criss-cross pattern still engraved the story of unforgotten passions. Another content warning there. He touched the new wounds gently with his fingers and winced at the fiery pain. She woke up then and saw him inspecting the marks. Have you missed the knife? She asked sleepily. Were you hungry for its touch? There was no need to lie now, and there was a delicious sense of freedom in that knowledge. There was a joy in being able to face her at last, quite naked in his thoughts as well as his flesh. Yes, my lady, he said with a slight croak in his voice. I had missed the knife. Its touch rekindled flames in my soul. She had closed her eyes again to allow herself to wake slowly. She laughed. It is pleasant sometimes to return to forsaken pastures. You can have no notion how a particular taste may stir memories. I am glad to have seen you again in this way. I had grown quite used to you as the grey mechanician. But now... He laughed, as lightly as she, but the laugh turned to a cough, and something in the sound alerted her to the fact that all was not as it should be. She opened her eyes and raised her head, turning towards him. "Why, Esmond," she said, "you're pale as death." She reached out to touch his cheek and snatched her hand away, again, as she found it unexpectedly hot and dry. A blush of confusion spread across her own features. He took her hand and held it, looking steadily into her eyes. "Edmund," she said softly, "what have you done?" "I can't be sure," he said, "and I will not live to find out. But I have tried to kill you, my lady." He was pleased by the way her mouth gaped in astonishment. He watched disbelief and anxiety mingle in her expression, as though fighting for control. She did not call out for help. "This is nonsense," she whispered. "Perhaps," he admitted. "Perhaps it was also nonsense that we talked last evening. Nonsense about treason. Why did you ask me to make the microscope, my lady, when you knew that making me a party to such a secret was as good as signing my death warrant?" "Oh, Esmond," she said with a sigh, "you could not think it was my own idea. I tried to protect you, Edmund, from Girard's fears and suspicions. It was because I was your protector that I was made to bear the message. What have you done, Edmund?" He began to reply, but the words turned into a fit of coughing. She sat upright, wrenching her hand away from his enfeebled grip, and looked down at him as he sank back upon the pillow. "For the love of God," she exclaimed, as fearfully as any true believer, "it is the plague out of Africa." He tried to confirm her suspicion, but could do so only with a nod of his head as he fought for breath. "But they held the Free Martin by the Essex coast for a full fortnight's quarantine," she protested. "There was no trace of plague aboard." "The disease kills men," said Edmund in a shallow whisper, "but animals can carry it in their blood, without dying." "You cannot know this." Edmund managed a small laugh. "My lady," he said, "I am a member of that fraternity that interests itself in everything that might kill a vampire. The information came to me in good time for me to arrange delivery of the rats, though when I asked for them, I had not in mind the means of using them that I eventually employed. More recent events..." Again he was forced to stop, unable to draw sufficient breath even to contain the thin whisper. The Lady Carmilla put her hand to her throat, swallowing as if she expected to feel evidence already of her infection. "You would destroy me, Edmund?" she asked, as though she genuinely found it difficult to believe. "I would destroy you all," he told her. "I would bring disaster, turn the world upside down to end your rule. We cannot allow you to stamp out learning itself to preserve your empire forever. Order must be fought with chaos, and chaos is come, my lady." When she tried to rise from the bed, he reached out to restrain her, and though there was no power left in him, she allowed herself to be checked. The coverlet fell away from her to expose her breasts as she sat upright. "The boy will die for this, Master Cordery," she said. "His mother, too." "They're gone," he told her. "Noah went from your table to the custody of the society that I serve. By now they're beyond your reach. The Archduke will never catch them." She stared at him, and now he could see the beginnings of hate and fear in her stare. "You came here last night to bring me poisoned blood," she said, "in the hope that this new disease might kill even me. You condemned yourself to death. What did you do, Edmund?" He reached out again to touch her arm, and was pleased to see her flinch and draw away, that he had become dreadful. "Only vampires live forever," he told her hoarsely, "but anyone may drink blood if they have the stomach for it. I took full measure from my 2 sick rats, and I pray to God that the seed of this fever is raging in my blood, and in my semen too. You too have received full measure, my lady, and you are in God's hands, now like any common mortal. I cannot know for sure whether you will catch the plague, or whether it would kill you, but I, an unbeliever, am not ashamed to pray. Perhaps you could pray too, my lady, so that we may know how the Lord favours one unbeliever over another." She looked down at him, her face gradually losing the expressions that had tugged at her features, becoming mask-like in its steadiness. "You could have taken our side, Edmund. I trusted you, and I could have made the Archduke trust you too. You could have become a vampire. We could have shared the centuries, you and I. This was dissimulation, and they both knew it. He had been her lover, and had ceased to be, and had grown older for so many years, that now she remembered him as much in his son as in himself. The promises were all too obviously hollow now, and she realised that she could not even taunt him with them. From beside the bed, she took up the small silver knife that she had used to let his blood. She held it now as if it were a dagger, not a delicate instrument to be used with care and love. I thought you still loved me, she told him. I really did. That, at least, he thought, might be true. He actually put his head farther back, to expose his throat to the expected thrust. He wanted her to strike him, angrily, brutally, passionately. He had nothing more to say, and would not confirm or deny that he did still love her. He admitted to himself now that his motives had been mixed, and that he really did not know whether it was loyalty to the fraternity that had made him submit to this extraordinary experiment. It did not matter. She cut his throat, and he watched her for a few long seconds while she stared at the blood gouting from the wound. When he saw her put stained fingers to her lips, knowing what she knew, he realised that after her own fashion, she still loved him. That was The Man Who Loved the Vampire Lady. Well, vampirism as an STD. Fascinating. Right, so I will take a break now. Everybody who's here, please take a break, stretch your legs, have a drink of something, do whatever you need, self-care things you need to do. Wow, my elbow hurts from holding that book in that position too long. And I will be back in I'll be back in 5 minutes or so. And we're back. Apologies for using the wrong OBS scene before then. That is the one I usually use for the end of the stream. Please see the chat for content warnings. There will probably be others that will come up as I'm reading. Welcome Izumi Hikari and anybody else who shows up later. So I will now be going on to F. Marion Crawford's For the Blood is the Life, which looks to be a slightly shorter one than the previous one. So we should be probably finished by about 10, I would say. Frances Marion Crawford, 1854 to 1909, was an American, born in Italy, but educated in the United States. A Sanskrit scholar, he mastered 18 languages and lived for many years in India, where he worked as a newspaper editor. He finally returned to Italy and died in Sorrento. One of the most popular and commercially successful authors of his day, he wrote more than 40 books, several in the fantasy and horror genres. However, his reputation as a short story writer rests on a single collection of 7 stories, Wandering Ghosts, Uncanny Tales in the UK, published posthumously in 1911. For the Blood is the Life contains all the archetypal trappings we have come to associate with the vampire story. Yet after more than 80 years, it still evokes a delightful shudder of dread. We had dined at sunset on the broad roof of the old tower, because it was cooler there during the great heat of summer. Besides, the little kitchen was built at one corner of the great square platform, which made it more convenient than if the dishes had to be carried down the steep stone steps, broken in places, and everywhere worn with age. The tower was one of those built all down the west coast of Calabria by the Emperor Charles V, early in the 16th century, to keep off the Barbary pirates, when the unbelievers were allied with Francis I against the Emperor and the Church. They have gone to ruin, a few still stand intact, and mine is one of the largest. How it came into my possession 10 years ago, and why I spend a part of each year in it, are matters which do not concern this tale. The tower stands in one of the loneliest spots in southern Italy, at the extremity of a curving, rocky promontory, which forms a safe, but small, natural harbour at the southern extremity of the Gulf of Policastro, and just north of Cape Scalea, the birthplace of Judas Iscariot, according to the old local legend. The tower stands alone on this hooked spur of the rock, and there is not a house to be seen within 3 miles of it. When I go there, I take a couple of sailors, one of whom is a fair cook, and when I am away, it is in charge of a gnome-like little being who was once a miner, and who attached himself to me long ago. My friend, who sometimes visits me in my summer solitude, is an artist by profession, a Scandinavian by birth, and a cosmopolitan by force of circumstances. We had dined at sunset. The sunset glow had reddened and faded again, and the evening purple steeped the vast chain of the mountains that embraced the deep gulf to eastward and reared themselves higher and higher towards the south. It was hot, and we sat at the landward corner of the platform, waiting for the night breeze to come down from the lower hills. The colour sank out of the air. There was a little interval of deep grey twilight, and a lamp sent a yellow streak from the open door of the kitchen, where the men were getting their supper. Then the moon rose suddenly above the crest of the promontory, flooding the platform and lighting up every little spur of rock and knoll of grass below us, down to the edge of the motionless water. My friend lighted his pipe and sat looking at a spot on the hillside. I knew that he was looking at it, and for a long time past I had wondered whether he would ever see anything there that would fix his attention. I knew that spot well. It was clear that he was interested at last, though it was a long time before he spoke. Like most painters, he trusts to his own eyesight, as a lion trusts his strength, and a stag his speed, and he is always disturbed when he cannot reconcile what he sees with what he believes that he ought to see. "It's strange," he said. "Do you see that little mound just on the side of the boulder?" "Yes," I said, and I guessed what was coming. "It looks like a grave," observed Holger. "Very true. It does look like a grave." "Yes," continued my friend, his eyes still fixed on the spot. "But the strange thing I see is that a body is lying on top of it. Of course," continued Holger, turning his head in one side, as artists do, "it must be an effect of light. In the first place, it is not a grave at all. Secondly, if it were, the body would be inside and not outside. Therefore, it's an effect of the moonlight, don't you see?" "Perfectly. I always see it on moonlight nights." "It doesn't seem to interest you much," said Holger. "On the contrary, it does interest me, though I am used to it. You're not so far wrong either. The mound is really a grave." "Nonsense!" cried Holger incredulously. "I suppose you'll tell me next that what I see lying on it is really a corpse." "No," I answered, "it's not. I know, because I have taken the trouble to go down and see." "Then what is it?" asked Holger. "It's nothing." "You mean that it's an effect of light, I suppose?" "Perhaps it is. But the inexplicable part of the matter is that it makes no difference whether the moon is rising, or setting, or waxing, or waning. If there's any moonlight at all, from east or west or overhead, as long as it shines on the grave, you can see the outline of the body on top." Holger stirred up his pipe with the point of his knife, and then used his finger for a stopper. When the tobacco burned well, he rose from his chair. "If you don't mind," he said, "I'll go down and take a look at it." He left me, crossed the roof, and disappeared down the dark steps. I did not move, but sat looking down until he came out of the tower below. I heard him humming an old Danish song as he crossed the open space in the bright moonlight, going straight to the mysterious mound. When he was 10 paces from it, Holger stopped short, made 2 steps forwards, then 3 or 4 backwards, and then stopped again. I know what that meant. He had reached the spot where the thing ceased to be visible, where, as he would have said it, the effect of light changed. Then he went on till he reached the mound, and stood upon it. I could see the thing still, but it was no longer lying down. It was on its knees now, winding its white arms round Holger's body, and looking up into his face. A cool breeze stirred my hair at that moment, as the night wind began to come down from the hills, but it felt like a breath from another world. The thing seemed to be trying to climb to its feet, helping itself up by Holger's body, while he stood upright, quite unconscious of it, and apparently looking towards the tower, which is very picturesque, when the moonlight falls upon it on that side. "Come along," I shouted. "Don't stay there all night." It seemed to me that he moved reluctantly as he stepped from the mound, or else with difficulty. That was it. The thing's arms were still round his waist, but its feet could not leave the grave. As he came slowly forward, it was drawn and lengthened like a wreath of mist, thin and white, till I saw distinctly that Holger shook himself as a man does who feels a chill. At the same instant, a little wail of pain came to me on the breeze. It might have been the cry of the small owl that lives among the rocks, and the misty presence floated swiftly back from Holger's advancing figure, and lay once more at its length upon the mound. Again I felt the cool breeze in my hair, and this time an icy thrill of dread ran down my spine. I remembered very well that I had once gone down there alone in the moonlight, that presently being near I had seen nothing, that like Holger I had gone and had stood upon the mound, and I remembered how, when I came back, sure that there was nothing there, I had felt the sudden conviction that there was something after all, if I would only look behind me. I remembered the strong temptation to look back, a temptation I had resisted as unworthy of a man of sense, until, to get rid of it, I had shaken myself just as Holger did. And now I knew that those white, misty arms had been round me too. I knew it in a flash, and I shuddered as I remembered that I had heard the night owl then too, but it had not been the night owl. It was the cry of the thing. I refilled my pipe and poured out a cup of strong southern wine. In less than a minute, Holger was seated beside me again. "Of course there's nothing there," he said, "but it's creepy all the same. Do you know, when I was coming back I was so sure that there was something behind me that I wanted to turn around and look. It was an effort not to." He laughed a little, knocked the ashes out of his pipe, and poured himself out some wine. For a while neither of us spoke, and the moon rose higher, and we both looked at the thing that lay on the mound. "You might make a story about that," said Holger after a long time. "There is one," I answered. "If you're not sleepy, I'll tell it to you." "Go ahead," said Holger, who likes stories. Old Ilario was dying up there in the village behind the hill. You remember him, I have no doubt. They say that he made his money by selling sham jewellery in South America, and escaped with his gains when he was found out. Like all those fellows, if they bring anything back with them, he at once set to work to enlarge his house, and as there are no masons here, he sent all the way to Paola for 2 workmen. They were a rough-looking pair of scoundrels, a Neapolitan who had lost one eye, and a Sicilian with an old scar, half an inch deep across his left cheeks. Oh, Neapolitans. I often saw them, for on Sundays they used to come down here and fish off the rocks. When Ilario caught the fever that killed him, the masons were still at work. As he had agreed that part of their pay should be their board and lodging, he made them sleep in the house. His wife was dead, and he had an only son called Angelo, who was a much better sort than himself. Angelo was to marry the daughter of the richest man in the village, and strange to say, though the marriage was arranged by their parents, the young people were said to be in love with each other. For that matter, the whole village was in love with Angelo, and among the rest, a wild, good-looking girl called Christina, who was more like a gypsy than any girl I ever saw about here. She had very red lips and very black eyes, and she was built like a greyhound and had the tongue of the devil. But Angelo did not care a straw for her. He was rather a simple-minded fellow, quite different from his old scoundrel of a father. Under what I should have called normal circumstances, I really believe that he would never have looked at any girl except the nice plump creature with the fat dowry, whom his father meant for him to marry. But things turned up which were neither normal nor natural. On the other hand, a very handsome young shepherd from the hills above Maratea was in love with Christina, who seems to have been quite indifferent to him. Christina had no regular means of subsistence, but she was a good girl, willing to do any work or go on errands to any distance for the sake of a loaf of bread or a mess of beans, and permission to sleep under cover. She was especially glad when she could get something to do about the house of Angelo's father. There is no doctor in the village, and when the neighbours saw that old Ilario was dying, they sent Christina to Scalea to fetch one. That was late in the afternoon, and if they had waited so long it was because the dying miser refused to allow any such extravagance while he was able to speak. But while Christina was gone, matters grew rapidly worse. The priest was brought to the bedside, and when he had done what he could, he gave it as his opinion to the bystanders that the old man was dead, and left the house. You know these people. They have a physical horror of death. Until the priest spoke, the room had been full of people. The words were hardly out of his mouth before it was empty. It was night now. They hurried down the dark steps and out into the street. Angelo, as I've said, was away. Christina had not come back. The simple woman-servant who had nursed the sick man fled with the rest, and the body was left alone in the flickering light of the earthen oil lamp. 5 minutes later, 2 men looked in cautiously and crept forward towards the bed. They were the one-eyed Neapolitan mason and his Sicilian companion. They knew what they wanted. In a moment they had dragged from under the bed a small but heavy iron-bound box, and long before anyone thought of coming back to the dead man, they had left the house and the village under cover of darkness. It was easy enough for Ilario's houses to last towards the gorge, which leads down here, and the thieves merely went out the back door, got over the stone wall, and had nothing to risk after that except the possibility of meeting some belated countryman, which was very small indeed, since few of the people used that path. They had a mattock and shovel, and they made their way without accident. I am telling you this story as it must have happened, for of course there were no witnesses to this part of it. The men brought the box down the gorge, intending to bury it until they should be able to come back and take it away in a boat. They must have been clever enough to guess that some of the money would be in paper notes, for they would otherwise have buried it on the beach in the wet sand, where it would have been much safer. But the paper would have rotted if they had been obliged to leave it there so long, so they dug their hole down there, close to that boulder. Yes, just where the mound is now. Cristina did not find the doctor in Scalea, for he had been sent for from a place up the valley, halfway to San Domenico. If she had found him, he would have come on his mule by the upper road, which is smoother, but much longer. But Cristina took the shortcut by the rocks, which passes about 50 feet above the mound, and goes round that corner. The men were digging when she passed, and she heard them at work. It would not have been like her to go by without finding out what the noise was, for she was never afraid of anything in her life, and besides, the fishermen sometimes come ashore here at night to get a stone for an anchor, or to gather sticks to make a little fire. The night was dark, and Cristina probably came close to the two men before she could see what they were doing. She knew them, of course, and they knew her, and understood instantly that they were in her power. There was only one thing to be done for their safety, and they did it. They knocked her on the head. They dug the hole deep. They buried her quickly with the iron-bound chest. They must have understood that their only chance of escaping suspicion lay in getting back to the village before their absence was noticed, for they returned immediately and were found half an hour later gossiping quietly with the man who was making Ilario's coffin. He was a crony of theirs, and had been working at the repairs in the old man's house. So far as I have been able to make out, the only persons who were supposed to know where Ilario kept his treasure were Angelo and the one woman servant I have mentioned. Angela was away. It was the woman who discovered the theft. It is easy enough to understand why no one else knew where the money was. The old man kept his door locked and the key in his pocket when he was out, and did not let the woman enter to clean the place unless he was there himself. The whole village knew that he had money somewhere, however, and the masons had probably discovered the whereabouts of the chest by climbing in at the window in his absence. If the old man had not been delirious until he lost consciousness, he would have been in frightful agony of mind for his riches. The faithful woman-servant forgot their existence only for a few moments when she fled with the rest, overcome by the horror of death. 20 minutes had not passed before she returned with the two hideous old hags who were always called in to prepare the death of Ariel. But even then she had not at first the courage to go near the bed with them, but she made a pretence of dropping something, went down on her knees as if to find it, and looked under the bedstead. The walls of the room were newly whitewashed down to the floor, and she saw at a glance that the chest was gone. It had been there in the afternoon. It had therefore been stolen in the short interval since she had left the room. There are no carabiniers stationed in the village. There is not so much as a municipal watchman, for there is no municipality. There never was such a place, I believe. Scalea is supposed to look after it in some mysterious way, and it takes a couple of hours to get anybody from there. As the old woman had lived in the village all her life, it did not even occur to her to apply to any civil authority for help. She simply set up a howl and ran through the village in the dark, screaming out that her dead master's house had been robbed. Many of the people looked out, but at first no one seemed inclined to help her. Most of them, judging her by themselves, whispered to each other that she had probably stolen the money herself. The first man to move was the father of the girl whom Angela was to marry. Having collected his household, all of whom felt a personal interest in the wealth which was to have come into the family, he declared it to be his opinion that the chest had been stolen by the two journeyman masons who lodged in the house. He headed a search for them which naturally began in Ilario's house and ended in the carpenter's workshop, where the thieves were found discussing a measure of wine with the carpenter over the half-finished coffin, by the light of one earthen lamp filled with oil and tallow. The search party at once accused the delinquents of the crime, and threatened to lock them up in the cellar till the carabiniers could be fetched from Scalea. The two men looked at each other for one moment, and then without the slightest hesitation, they put out the single light, seized the unfinished coffin between them, and using it as a sort of battering ram, dashed upon their assailants in the dark. In a few moments they were beyond pursuit. That is the end of the first part of the story. The treasure had disappeared, and as no trace of it could be found, the people naturally supposed that the thieves had succeeded in carrying it off. The old man was buried, and when Angelo came back at last, he had to borrow some money to pay for the miserable funeral, and had some difficulty in doing so. He hardly needed to be told that in losing his inheritance he had lost his bride. In this part of the world, marriages are made on strictly business principles, and if the promised cash is not forthcoming on the appointed day, the bride or bridegroom whose parents have failed to produce it may as well take themselves off, for there will be no wedding. Poor Angelo knew that well enough. His father had been possessed of hardly any land, and now that the hard cash which had been brought from South America was gone, there was nothing left but debts for the building materials that were to have been used in enlarging and improving their old house. Angelo was beggared, and the nice plump little creature who was to have been his turned her nose up at him in the most approved fashion. As for Cristina, it was several days before she was missed, for no one remembered that she had been sent to Scalea for the doctor, who had never come. She often disappeared in the same way for days together, when she could find a little work here and there at the distant farmers among the hills. But when she did not come back at last, people began to wonder, and at last made up their minds that she had connived with the Masons and had escaped with them. I paused and emptied my glass. That sort of thing could happen anywhere else, observed Holger, filling his everlasting pipe again. It is wonderful what natural charm there is about murder and sudden death in a romantic country like this. Deeds that would be simply brutal and disgusting anywhere else become dramatic and mysterious because this is Italy and we're living in a genuine tower of Charles V built against some genuine Barbary pirates. There's something in that, I admitted. Holger is the most romantic man in the world inside of himself, but he always thinks it necessary to explain why he feels anything. I suppose they found the poor girl's body with the box, he said presently. As it seems to interest you, I answered, I'll tell you the rest of the story. The moon had risen by this time. The outline of the thing on the mound was clearer to our eyes than before. The village very soon settled down to its small, dull life. No one missed old Ilario, who had been away so much on his voyages to South America that he had never been a familiar figure in his native place. Angelo lived in the half-finished house, and because he had no money to pay the old woman-servant, she would not stay with him, but once in a long time she would come and wash a shirt for him for old acquaintances' sake. Besides the house, he had inherited a small patch of ground at some distance from the village. He tried to cultivate it, but he had no heart in the work, for he knew he could never pay the taxes on it, and on the house, which would certainly be confiscated by the government, or seized for the debt of the building material, which the man had supplied it had refused to take back. Angelo was very unhappy. So long as his father had been alive and rich, every girl in the village had been in love with him, but that was all changed now. It had been pleasant to be admired and courted and invited to drink wine by fathers who had girls to marry. It was hard to be stared at coldly, and sometimes laughed at because he had been robbed of his inheritance. He cooked his miserable meals for himself, and from being sad became melancholy and morose. At twilight, when the day's work was done, instead of hanging out in the open space before the church with the young fellows of his own age, he took to wandering in the lonely places on the outskirts of the village until it was quite dark. Then he slunk home and went to bed to save the expense of a light. But in those lonely twilight hours he began to have strange waking dreams. He was not always alone, for often when he sat on the stump of a tree, where the narrow path turns down the gorge, he was sure that a woman came up noiselessly over the rough stones, as if her feet were bare, and she stood under a clump of chestnut trees, only a half-dozen yards down the path, and beckoned to him without speaking. Though she was in the shadow, he knew that her lips were red, and that when they parted a little and smiled at him, she showed two small, sharp teeth. He knew this at first rather than saw it, and he knew that it was Christina, and that she was dead. Yet he was not afraid. He only wondered whether it was a dream, for he thought that if he had been awake, he should have been frightened. Besides, the dead woman had red lips, and that could only happen in a dream. Whenever he went near the gorge after sunset, she was already there waiting for him, or else she very soon appeared, and he began to be sure that she came a little nearer to him every day. At first he had only been sure of her blood-red mouth, but now each feature grew distinct, and the pale face looked at him with deep and hungry eyes. It was the eyes that grew dim. Little by little, he came to know that some day the dream would not end when he turned away to go home, but would lead him down the gorge out of which the vision rose. She was nearer now when she beckoned to him. Her cheeks were not livid like those of the dead, but pale with starvation, with the furious and unappeased physical hunger of her eyes that devoured him. They feasted on his soul and cast a spell over him, and at last they were close to his own and held him. He could not tell whether her breath was as hot as fire, or as cold as ice. He could not tell whether her red lips burnt his, or froze them, or whether her 5 fingers on his wrists seared scorching scars, or bit his flesh like frost. He could not tell whether he was awake or asleep, whether she was alive or dead, but he knew that she loved him, she alone of all creatures, earthly or unearthly, and her spell had power over him. When the moon rose high that night, the shadow of that thing was not alone down there upon the mound. Angelo awoke in the cold dawn, drenched with dew and chilled through flesh and bone and blood. He opened his eyes to the faint grey light and saw the stars still shining overhead. He was very weak, and his heart was beating so slowly that he was almost like a man fainting. Slowly he turned his head on the mound, and as on a pillow, but the other face was not there. Fear seized him suddenly, a fear unspeakable and unknown. He sprang to his feet and fled up the gorge, but he never looked behind him until he reached the door on on the outskirts of the village. Drearily he went to his work that day, and wearily the hours dragged themselves after the sun, till at last it touched the sea and sank, and the great sharp hills above Maratea turned purple against the dove-coloured eastern sky. Angelo shouldered his heavy hoe and left the field. He felt less tired now than in the morning when he'd begun to work, but he promised himself that he would go home without lingering by the gorge, and eat the best supper he could get himself, and sleep all night in his bed like a Christian man. Not again would he be tempted down the narrow way by a shadow with red lips and icy breath. Not again would he dream that dream of terror and delight. He was near the village now. It was half an hour since the sun had set, when the cracked church bell sent little discordant echoes across the rocks and ravines to tell all good people that the day was done. Angelo stood still a moment when the path forked, where it led toward the village on the left, and down to the gorge on the right, where a clump of chestnut trees overhung the narrow way. He stood still a minute, lifting his battered hat from his head and gazing at the fast-fading sea westward, and his lips moved as he silently repeated the familiar evening prayer. His lips moved, but the words that followed him in his brain lost their meaning and turned into others, and ended in a name that he spoke aloud. Christina. With the name, the tension of his will relaxed suddenly. Reality went out, and the dream took him again, and bore him on swiftly and surely, like a man walking in his sleep down by the steep path in the gathering darkness. And as she glided beside him, Christina whispered strange, sweet things in his ear, which somehow, if he had been awake, he knew that he could not quite have understood. But now they were the most wonderful words he'd ever heard in his life. And she kissed him also, but not upon his mouth. He felt her sharp kisses upon his white throat, and he knew that her lips were red. So the wild dream sped on through twilight and darkness and moonrise, and all the glory of the summer's night. But in the chilly dawn he lay as one half dead upon the mound, down there, recalling and not recalling, drained of his blood, yet strangely longing to give those red lips more. Then came the fear, the awful, nameless panic, the mortal horror that guards the confines of the world we see not, neither know of as we know of other things, but which we feel when its icy chill freezes our bones and stirs our hair with the touch of a ghostly hand. Once more Angelo sprang from the mound and fled up the gorge in the breaking day, but his step was less sure this time, and he panted for breath as he ran. And when he came to the bright spring of water that rises halfway up the hillside, he dropped upon his knees and hands and plunged his whole face in and drank as he had never drunk before, for it was the thirst of the wounded man who has lain bleeding all night long upon the battlefield. She had him fast now, and he could not escape her, but would come to her every evening at dusk until she had drained him of his last drop of blood. It was in vain that when the day was done he tried to take another turning, and to go home by a path that did not lead near the gorge. It was in vain that he made promises to himself each morning at dawn, when he climbed the lonely way up from the shore to the village. It was all in vain, for when the sun sank burning into the sea and the coolness of the evening stole out, as from a hiding place, to delight the weary world, his feet turned toward the old way, and she was waiting for him in the shadow under the chestnut trees. And then it all happened as before, and she fell to kissing his white throat, even as she flitted lightly down the way, winding one arm about him. And as his blood failed, she grew more hungry and more thirsty every day, and every day when he awoke in the early dawn it was harder to rouse himself to the effort of climbing the steep path to the village. And when he went to his work his feet dragged painfully. There was hardly strength in his arms to wield the heavy hoe. He scarcely spoke to anyone now, but the people said he was consuming himself for love of the girl he was to have married when he lost his inheritance, and they laughed heartily at the thought, for this is not a very romantic country. Harsh. At this time, Antonio, the man who stays here to look after the tower, returned from a visit to his people who live near Salerno. He had been away all the time since before Ilario's death, and knew nothing of what had happened. He has told me that he came back late in the afternoon and shut himself in the tower to eat and sleep, for he was very tired. It was past midnight when he awoke, and when he looked out the waning moon was rising over the shoulder of the hill. He looked out towards the mound, and he saw something, and he did not sleep again that night. When he went out again in the morning it was broad daylight, and there was nothing to be seen on the mound but loose stones and driven sand. Yet he did not go very near it. He went straight up the path to the village and directly to the house of the old priest. "I have seen an evil thing this night," he said. "I have seen how the dead drink the blood of the living, and the blood is the life." "Tell me what you have seen," said the priest in reply. Antonio told him everything he had seen. "You must bring your book and your holy water tonight," he added. "I will be here before sunset to go down with you. and if it pleases your reverence to sup with me while I wait, I will make ready." "I will come," the priest answered, "for I have read in old books of these strange beings which are neither quick nor dead, and which lie ever fresh in their graves, stealing out in the dusk to taste life and blood." Antonio cannot read, but he was glad to see that the priest understood the business, for of course the books must have instructed him as to the best way of quieting the half-living thing forever. So Antonio went away to his work, which consists largely in sitting on the shady side of the tower when he's not perched upon a rock with a fishing line catching nothing. But on that day he went twice to look at the mound in the bright sunlight, and he searched round around it for some hole through which the being might get in and out, but he found none. When the sun began to sink and the air was cooler in the shadows, he went up to fetch the old priest, carrying a little wicker basket with him, and in this they placed a bottle of holy water and the basin and sprinkler, and the stole which the priest would need, and they came down and waited in the door of the tower till it should be dark. But while the light still lingered very grey and faint, they saw something moving, just there. 2 figures, a man's that walked and a woman's that flitted beside him, and while her head lay on his shoulder she kissed his throat. The priest had told me that too, and as his teeth chattered and he grasped Antonio's arm, the vision passed and disappeared into the shadow. Then Antonio got the leathern flask of strong liquor which he kept for great occasions, and poured such a draught as made the old man feel almost young again. He gave the priest his stole to put on, and the holy water to carry, and they went out together towards the spot where the work was to be done. Antonio says that in spite of the rum, his own knees shook together, and the priest stumbled over his Latin. For when they were yet a few yards from the mound, the flickering light of the lantern fell upon Angelo's white face, unconscious as if in sleep, and on his upturned throat, over which a very thin red line of blood trickled down into his collar. And the flickering light of the lantern played upon another face that looked up from the feast, upon 2 deep, dead eyes that saw in spite of death, upon parted lips redder than life itself, upon 2 gleaming teeth on which glistened a rosy drop. Then the priest, good old man, shut his eyes tight and showered holy water before him, and his cracked voice rose almost to a scream. And then Antonio, who is no coward after all, raised his pick in one hand and the lantern in the other, as he sprang forward not knowing what the end should be, and then as he swears that he heard a woman's cry and the thing was gone, and Angelo lay alone on the mound unconscious, with the red line on his throat and the beads of deathly sweat on his cold forehead. They lifted him, half dead as he was, and laid him on the ground close by. Then Antonio went to work, and the priest helped him, though he was old and could not do much. And they dug deep, and at last Antonio, standing in the grave, stooped down with his lantern to see what he might see. His hair used to be dark brown, with grizzled streaks about the temples. In less than a month from that day, he was as grey as a badger. He was a miner when he was young, and most of these fellows have seen ugly sights now and then, when accidents have happened. But he had not seen what he saw that night, that thing which is neither alive nor dead, that thing which will abide neither above ground nor in the grave. Antonio had brought something with him which the priest had not noticed. He had made it that afternoon. A sharp stake, shaped from a piece of tough old driftwood. He had taken it with him now, and he had his heavy pick, and he had taken the lantern down in the grave. I don't think any power on earth could make him speak of what happened then, and the old priest was too frightened to look in. He says he heard Antonio breathing like a wild beast, moving as if he were fighting with something almost as strong as himself, and he heard an evil sound also, with blows, as if something violently driven through flesh and bone, and then the most awful sound of all, a woman's shriek, the unearthly scream of a woman neither dead nor alive, but buried deep for many days. And he, the poor old priest, could only rock himself, as he knelt there in the sand, crying aloud his prayers and exorcisms to drown those awful sounds. Then suddenly a small iron-bound chest was thrown up and rolled over against the old man's knee, and in a moment more Antonio was beside him, his face as white as tallow in the flickering light of the lantern, shovelling the sand and pebbles into the grave with furious haste, and looking over the edge till the pit was half full, and the priest said that there was much fresh blood on Antonio's hands and on his clothes. I had come to the end of my story. Holger finished his wine and leaned back in his chair. "So Angelo got his own again," he said. "Did he marry the prim and plump young person to whom he had been betrothed?" "No, he had been badly frightened. He went to South America, and he has not been heard of since." "And that poor thing's body is still there, I suppose," said Holger. "Is it quite dead yet, I wonder?" "I wonder too. But whether it be dead or alive, I should hardly care to see it, even in broad daylight. Antonio is as grey as a badger, and he has never been quite the same man since that night." that is the end of For the Blood is Life by F. Marion Crawford. If anybody stuck around with me all this time, thank you very much. I hope you have an excellent festive period. I may do this again in 2 weeks, depending on Christmas arrangements and that sort of thing. Thank you very much. And so I will put the VOD up on YouTube later, in case people miss things. But thank you very much for listening. And remember, good night out there, whatever you are.